There's so much content about everything. The core question of the next few years is, who do people trust?
If it's written the right way and it's written with an editorial bent and it's written with the user in mind, it's trusted. Hello and welcome to the Health Tech Marketing Show. I'm your host, Adam Trinas, CEO of Health Launchpad. Before we dive in, I want to give a big thank you to our sponsors. There's HIMSS, who've been with us for a while, the global advisor and community dedicated to transforming healthcare through information and technology. And also to Healthcare Now Radio, the go-to podcast and radio network for health IT leaders, marketers, and innovators across the healthcare industry. We love being part of their network. They've really boosted our exposure. I think they've probably 5x'd our exposure in the last 6 months. And we were really proud that at the end of 2025, they wrapped up with a countdown of the most downloaded or most listened to episodes. And one of our episodes on Model Mania was the #1 episode for 2025. So thank you to Carol and Roberta at Healthcare Now Radio. Today, I'm joined by John Lynn, founder of Healthcare IT Today and Sway Health, the conference and the amazing community for healthcare technologists. John has been covering healthcare technology for over 20 years. And today, we're going to talk about sponsored content, what it used to be, what it is today, and where we think it's going. I think you're going to really enjoy this conversation. I certainly did. John's going to break down why sponsored content works when it's done right, and the importance of things like education, and why trust is the real currency for 2026. So if you've ever wondered how to get more out of sponsored content and how to get it working really, really well, listen to what John has to say. You're going to learn a lot. John, good to see you. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. There's always plenty to talk about.
There always is. I've always enjoyed having you and Brittany and Colin on the show. You always bring so much value to our audience. You're very well known in this market, but for those of you who don't know you, tell us a little bit about tell us your story. It's always really interesting.
Yeah, sure. So, I started as a tech guy. That's why I'm tech guy on Twitter, which is X or whatever it's called these days. But, I started writing about healthcare technology on Healthcare IT Today 20 years ago, which is absolutely insane. Quit the day job 15 years ago, been full-time media ever since. So Healthcare IT Today is our health IT publication, and then Sway Health is our healthcare marketing community. You're very familiar with what we publish, the podcast, the conference, everything that's there. So that's Healthcare Scene. The overarching company in a whole is Healthcare IT Today, our health IT publication, and Sway Health, the healthcare marketing community.
Yeah. One of the things that I think that you guys do extremely well is sponsored content. And I think you do it creatively and you bring a lot to the party when you do it. I don't think of you as doing it in a formulaic way, the way that some media vendors, maybe outside of our industry, do that. But, it's sponsored content. If you go back a few years, was something that was a bit of a nice to have, something that maybe made the list. But these days, it's seen as kind of a must have on most people's marketing plans. But it's evolved a lot. And I'd really love to get you to kind of tell us a bit about how you see the whole area of sponsored content today, and what led to the state of today's current market of sponsored content in our industry.
Yeah, it's interesting to see the evolution. As I said, 20 years ago was the first article I ever published. And back then it was great. You just put up some display ads and then said, talk to you in 6 months, and after 6 months, you'd look at the results and it was great. And some days I miss it, quite frankly. But what's interesting is the impact of a banner ad just diminished over time. People weren't clicking them. They weren't looking at them. They were becoming blind to them. And so what we saw is this evolution towards sponsored content or native advertising, if you will. where the content is the advertisement. And so, I think that's why sponsored content became so popular, is that people weren't clicking on the others. Although ironically, our display ads on Healthcare IT Today still do really well, because we tell them, don't do a display ad, do another piece of content, right? Like, act like the ad is a piece of content as opposed to, hey, come buy our service, right? And so to me, that's the overarching thing that's happened, is we've moved away from trying to sell something to educating the market. Mm-hmm. And this is particularly valuable in the B2B space, where it is about education. It is about trust. It is about credibility, as opposed to, hey, buy this t-shirt. Oh, I'm going to impulse buy this t-shirt, right? Like, that's not how it works in B2B. You have to educate and show that you're an expert of something, that you understand the problem domain better than someone else. And if you do that, you're going to make sales. And that's why sponsored content is so valuable. It's not because you're paying to do a sales pitch for your product. If you do that, you're going to fail. That's not going to work. It's not going to be effective. But if you do sponsored content as a way to educate and to show your expertise, then it works really well. So to me, that's the evolution and the understanding that was required to do sponsored content. Ironically, I was part of Paper Post, which was one of the very first like paid posting things. The guy got tons of like bad press and hammered for saying, what, you're going to pay for content? It was, and at the time, quite frankly, most people just wanted to pay for a link to be able to influence SEO. Well, we've come a long way since then, where now it's really about sharing high quality content as opposed to buying a link or making a sales pitch.
I think there are some of the media outlets that just do pay for play, right? Or predominantly. Yeah. I
mean, what's interesting is that, is paying bad, right? That is the core question that you have to think about. And if you're paying to do a sales pitch, then it probably is bad, right? It's bad for the consumer. It's bad for this person trying to sell something. It's probably not a good thing. But the way we look at it at Healthcare IT Today in particular, although on Sway Health as well, the way we look at sponsored content is you're not actually paying to be able to do a sales pitch. What are you paying for? What you're paying for is priority for us to tell your story rather than someone else's. Because when I go to HIMSS, there's 1,300 vendors or however many there are, right? 1,100 these days. There's that many vendors that all want me to tell their story. Well, how do I choose the priority of what stories are told? One way to change that priority is to pay. The second is collaboration. I want to collaborate with you on the content that's being shared. If you do an editorial one, good luck. Like, they can do whatever they want. I can do whatever I want, whereas if it's a paid one, I'm going to collaborate with you. And you may push back against me and say, hey, this doesn't seem accurate to what is. And I can say, no, that is accurate. And let's have that discussion, right? Or vice versa, right? I can go to them and say, hey, this isn't valuable for you. And if you have a good partner who understands how to market to hospitals, health systems, CIOs, then that works out well as a collaboration on the content to ensure that it is a quality content. And I'm not trying to gotcha. I'm not trying to surprise you, because I'm not searching for clicks. I'm searching to provide value to my community of people, in my case, the CIO leaders and IT leaders at hospitals, health systems, medical practices. And then finally, just to hit the triumvirate, right, is distribution. You're paying for distribution. And that's something a lot of people don't understand. If you do an editorial one with Healthcare IT Today, I'm going to promote it. I'm going to share it on social 5 or 10 times. I'm going to share it on an email newsletter. It's going to go out there to 48,000 email subscribers. But if you do a paid one, I'm going to do 4 times as much promotion of that on social media, on email, etc. So to me, that's the really big change with sponsored content, is making your story a priority. 2, it's collaborating on the content, so you get the best content that's useful to the readers. And then also for the extra distribution that we provide anyone who does sponsored content with us.
What do the consumption metrics tell you? Is there any difference in terms of views and engagement and dwell time and sort of generally sort of how much time people spend reading content that's paid versus just part of you reporting on an issue in the market?
So I'll say there's two metrics that I think are interesting to look at. The first metric is the metric of how many CIOs or readers have reached out and said, why did you do this drivel? Why did you publish this sponsored content, right? You're sold out, you're whatever, right? And we have gotten zero feedback in that way. In fact, we get quite the opposite, where the CIOs say, thank you so much for publishing that. I learned so much from that article. And so we've seen zero different reaction from editorial content versus sponsored content. So from that perspective, to me, they think it's the same. Now, I think the reason that is because any sponsored content we do, we want to make sure that it is valuable for our audience. I mean, that's core to what we do. If we didn't do that, we probably would get more complaints. So the second metric that's really interesting is just the overall numbers. And I'll tell you, the metrics on the sponsored content are 3 to 4 times as much as editorial content. And it goes back to us doing all the extra promotion. So that's why it gets all the extra views and downloads or whatever it is that we're promoting, right? So, people read it and download it more because we're actually marketing the content for the sponsor of that content. So it's one of those things that's really interesting. You would think editorial would be consumed more because it's editorial, but sponsored, at least on Healthcare IT Today, and other publications may be different, right? But on Healthcare IT Today, our sponsored stuff gets a lot more views because of the extra work we do to promote that content.
Do you ever reject something that you receive from a customer, or do you we've done sponsored content with you and you just do it in a collaborative way, so I don't even think about it as sponsored content. I think of it as it's part of a sponsorship package. We've received the opportunity to do an interview with you, but I'm wondering if you ever sort of push back on a customer.
I'd say we push back more on articles than we do videos. Articles, we've pushed back more when they send something where you're like, that's not really providing value, right? Or that's too much of a sales pitch. And that sales pitch is not going to be good for you. It's not going to be good for us, and it's not going to be good for the reader. So we have to push back on you. On the video side, the podcast side, we don't get much of that. The only thing we do get is that sometimes we have to reframe how the questions are being done, because that's probably the most common thing that happens to us. And we tell marketing people, we say, this is fine. This is what we do. This is part of the value that we provide you. We say, you said be as sales pitchy as you want to me. That's fine. Then I'm going to take that sales pitch and I'm going to reframe it into quality content. So it's fine for you to tell me, hey, we want to be known as the very best HIE vendor that can solve problems for HIEs, right? And this is why we're better, is because our reliability and our trust and all this, right? And then I'll reframe that into questions that are very editorial, but allow you to share why you're trusted, to share why people care about security and and why that matters and how much you invest in it and what that means, right? Or what the value is to the customer. So I'd say we don't have that problem very much on the video side because it is a collaborative process. To me, it makes me proud that you said, I don't really see the difference between editorial and paid. It's because at the end of the day, the editorial and paid are a similar format of how we're going to create the content. Again, it's about priority and distribution as opposed to what we're actually saying.
Yeah, I mean, I think of when we've taken part in a sponsored content program with you, again, it's sort of as a sort of a value-added part of a sponsorship of the Sway event. It felt like we were taking part in editorial, and what we were getting was the opportunity to tell our story. However, I think when it comes to the top, the whole field of sponsored content, it's quite a broad area. And I've heard clients refer to sponsored content as essentially kind of pay per lead. You do a sponsorship of a content piece that you may or may not have anything to do with, but you're placing a piece of gated content in there on the promise that you're going to get X number of leads for Y number of dollars. I don't think you guys do that kind of thing, right?
It's interesting you say that because Colin and I are working on that right now. So This is breaking news on the Health Launchpad health tech show. But what we've realized is a lot of people wanted us to create assets for them to do like ebooks, right? Things like that. We found in that process that they often dumb them down when we go through the process with them of creating something that's interesting and useful. And so we're exploring, we're like, what if we were to say, here's the 5 ebooks we're going to create. Do you want to sponsor it? And they can then see the ebook, and we can create them in a way that's going to be valuable to the users that actually want to download it. And then they'll see what it is and be able to do it. So it's kind of what you're saying, right? Like instead of them saying, we want an ebook and we want this topic and we want to control the narrative, instead we say, hey, we know what's going to resonate with our audience because we understand this industry well and what they care about. Could we create the ebook and then have someone sponsor that ebook, and then they get the leads off of that? So we're exploring what that would look like, and we think it would do really well, because to what I was saying is that people want the raw, unadulterated, trusted truth and value that's available. And, if you're a vendor that's willing to associate with that, there's a lot of value there.
It's an interesting idea. I hadn't really heard about that. Certainly wasn't what I was really referring to. What I was really referring to is I've tried these programs out with customers. There are companies out there like, say, Infuse Media or Netline, where you have a piece of content and you basically do a lead generation campaign. They get it in front of. So, and actually, what I suspect when it's referred to as sponsored content, it's probably erroneous actually, because it's really just lead gen in that case.
Yeah, I would describe that more as lead gen. Although, we'll often take our ebooks and put them on there as well, right? To drive the right leads. But yeah, I'd say that's probably more lead gen than sponsored content. Although it's interesting because you are kind of sponsoring that white paper ebook. So it gets fuzzy, right? When you start talking about it. And, to me, at the end of the day, that core value is, did the person that got that piece of content glean some sort of value, some sort of benefit to their career? If they did, then they don't really care too much about how it's paid for.
Yeah, that makes sense. You guys are a small, scrappy company. You're very entrepreneurial. When you look at some of the bigger players, and I'm not suggesting for a minute you name names here, but do you see a shift in the way that in the role of sponsored content with what they do versus display advertising, the changes there?
I think everyone's embraced sponsored content. I don't think they have a choice, quite frankly. I don't think there's enough leads to do there. I don't think there's enough people who want branding from, different things. So I think you have to embrace sponsored content as a media publication. So, it's interesting to see the different forms and formats that people are doing and how they approach it. And are they keeping the divide between the editorial and the sales? Obviously in our case, we don't have that divide. We just want to create great content that's valuable, and we think if we do that, then it's fine. People are okay with it. But yeah, I think everyone has, so much so that many agencies are coming to me and saying the only way to get coverage on there is to pay. And that's been quite a shift for a lot of agencies, because they're just like, what does that mean for our future business model? And there's a lot of agencies that are questioning, what does that mean? And I think we're going to see diverse editorial opportunities. I mean, we're doing that at Healthcare IT Today. We have our bonus features. We do our guest articles. We do our quote alerts, where we, incorporate a lot of different editorial. We do short videos at conferences. And so I think that that's what's probably going to happen, is we're going to see a more diverse set of editorial coverage from different people, especially as we embrace video. Like, we are such a video first organization, and I think a lot of people are embracing that as well. But we'll see, it's going to be interesting, especially as budgets tighten. We know it's all being tightened up right now. People have to be more selective in where they spend their money. And they're going to have to think, who do I want to work with and at what price? And if you've scaled up your editorial team and you're paying so much, well, you got to pay for it somehow. And, a lot of them scaled too big, I think. And so, luckily we don't have that problem as a scrappy one. We're slim and trim. But a lot of those organizations, I mean, I remember when the AMA shut down, was it called AMA News or AMA? It was like the health IT publication of the AMA, and they had $25 million in revenue and they couldn't make it work. And you're just like, what did you do? How did you set up your business model that 25 million in revenue, you couldn't figure out a way to make this work? Maybe they're just making too much from CPT codes. I don't know. It was astounding, right? That 25 million in revenue and you can't make your business model work and you just shut it down.
That's nutty. That's just not being able to run a media company. 25
Well,
million.
and I think we'd be surprised how many media companies have too much overhead and it's problematic.
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned video. What's the mix these days in terms of different formats? I mean, actually, to start off with, it'd be quite interesting to get you to kind of lay out all of the different formats of sponsored content you do or you see some of the other players do.
Yeah, I mean, for us, we have two main forms of sponsored content. It's video and then also articles. Those are really the main forms that we have. Outside of that, we are creative with people. So we'll do some other things. We've done conference specific sponsored ones, which usually include videos, but some other coverage as well often. So we've done those types of things. Other things that I see happening, it's a form of sponsored content, if you will, which is all of these dinners. We see those exploding, right? There's so many people doing so many dinners, so much so that some of the CIOs are telling me, John, I don't know if I can go to another dinner, which is interesting, right? Like, you're like, I get it, right? You can get a free dinner anytime you want from any vendor. Yeah. Like, is that really that valuable to you? But we see a lot of people doing that, and they do it under the guise of come and connect with peers, and there's great content and discussion that happens. So I'd say that's another interesting form of sponsored content. We also see people doing things like microsites, or, we've even done some of that over the years, but, microsites or micro publications or things like that. That's the other form of sponsored content where a lot of the media companies out there are partnering with vendors and saying, hey, you're so niche. What can we do together to kind of hit that niche in a good way and create content that you can use in your marketing? So I'd say those are probably the most common ones that I see.
Podcasts. I mean, that's typically something that you do yourself. So you're creating your own content, but I'm curious to know if you're seeing, because distribution makes a big difference, right? So I'm just wondering if you've ever approached by someone to say, hey, because you've got greater reach than we've got, could you do a podcast for us?
Yeah, I mean, we see a couple models there. One is, first, are there any podcasts that aren't doing video? I don't know. It's evolving, right? So video and podcasts in some ways.
I think the really kind of big ones like the Darkesh podcast, I don't think he does a video. Yeah, but I'm not sure I'd want to watch them for 3 hours, having these kind of long, in-depth.
Yeah, that's fair. And when you look at the direct-to-consumer ones, the entertainment ones, the comedy ones, some of them, definitely have the distribution. But in the B2B side of things, there's a few that still do podcasts only, but increasingly we're seeing video. Obviously, it has a lot of power and availability. Yeah. But I think people are sponsoring the podcast itself. They want to be on the podcast. They want to be part of the podcast. And so, I think we're seeing fewer sponsorships, especially on the B2B side of podcasts, as opposed to sponsored content, where literally they are the content of the podcast. So I think we're seeing that more often. The other thing we're seeing, which I don't know if this is a form of sponsored content or not, but we see a lot of podcasts where they're like, I did the podcast, but I want to syndicate to Healthcare Now Radio. And I want to syndicate my podcast there just for distribution. Yeah, you understand, right? So, we do too, ironically, although we do it through partnership. But, and so I think that's the other one. Because at the end of the day, media is a pretty simple thing.
Yeah.
You have distribution and people want access to some of that distribution, right? Now, are you going to get that through editorial? Are you going to get that through paid? Are you going to get that through an ad? Are you going to, at the end of the day, it's a pretty simple concept. I have the attention of someone, some community, some buyer that you want to influence, you want to have hear your message. How are you going to get it out there? You can purchase some access to their attention.
Yeah, it's funny. I didn't know that you were part of the Healthcare Now Radio Network, Answer Media Network. We are too. And so we actually, fun enough, it's great things happen at Sway. I spent a lot of time getting to know Carol Flagg at the last Sway conference, and we talked about it. And so they've been syndicating the Health Tech Now Health Tech Now. What's the name of my show? The Health Tech Marketing Show. That's it. That's the name of this show. Health Tech Marketing Show. And the results have been fantastic. I think they probably 5x'd our exposure. And we're now getting months, when I was doing like maybe a couple of episodes a month, I would have months where I'd maybe get 100 downloads total. It was like, why am I doing this? But first of all, we've changed up the frequency. We've changed a whole bunch of things. But I think, in large part, thanks to the syndication with Answer, what are they called? Answer Media Network. Yeah, there you go. Yeah, Healthcare Now Radio on their podcast. We have, 1,000+ months. In fact, they did a countdown at the end of the year. And my God, what a great way to end the year. On New Year's Eve, they said, I think that the episode that we did on what we call Model Mania, all the kind of crazy stuff that was going on with the different models, was the number one podcast of number of downloads of the year, which was like, wow, that was really cool. But believe me, that keeps me going. It's
interesting how numbers do keep you going, right? And what's fascinating to me about all of this is that we've seen this happen before. Like when I first started Healthcare IT Today, everyone had a blog. Every company was starting a blog. They were writing a blog. They had a blog. Individuals had blogs, whatever, right? There was this explosion of blogs, right? And then, after a year or 2 years, some of them creating amazing content, right? They'd look at their stats and they'd be like, why am I getting 20 views, 50 views, that? And then companies were saying, why are we spending all this money creating content for 50 views, right? It didn't make sense to them. And a lot of them missed the fact that, hey, you can create the content, but you have to market the content. Content doesn't just market itself. You have to do work to actually market the content. Your product is just the content as opposed to something else. And so you have to market it to get people to watch. And so a lot of people miss that. And so then they stopped, right? They're like, why are we wasting our time? I think we're in the same cycle with podcasts. And whether it's podcasts or videos, and there's this explosion of companies creating podcasts and creating videos and things like that. And it turns out podcasts and videos are 5x, 10x harder to create than a blog, right? Like it's more time consuming. Yeah. It costs more, all of those things, right? It's so much more. And so I actually think the fall off from people creating podcasts is going to happen quicker than what happened with blogs, where they look at it and they're like, wait, we had 20 people download the podcast. Like, why are we doing it? Exactly what you said, right? So if you don't have a way to distribute the content, then in many cases, there's a few other models out there, but in many cases, you're going to be like, why are we spending money on this? We should spend it somewhere else. Right. And so, to your point, I think, Healthcare Now Radio does a great job with those people who have podcasts that want to get distribution. I think it's also our business model at Healthcare IT Today. There's so many marketers that realize I should not start a podcast because that's a lot of work and I have to spend a lot of time to make it successful. And so instead of starting their own, they come to people like me or other organizations and say, why don't we just be on John's? He already has the distribution. He already has the promotion, infrastructure. And they're like, we might as well do a sponsored one that's cheaper than creating it ourselves. And by the way, if we create it ourselves, not as many people will even listen. So, I think those are the models we see evolving.
I think one of the most interesting things that I've seen in media and marketing in our industry, this is happening in other B2B industries, is how communities are becoming content. So take Project 229, the Bill Russell's thing. And, also sort of a lot of what Ed Marks does as well. He has his, little networking dinners and whatnot at HIMSS. I think that for a lot of marketers and salespeople, those are great because they're opportunities to meet and interact with potential prospects. But it's also, what they learn from those events is content. And the same way that what you do with Sway is, I don't go there to meet prospective customers particularly, although that we've got some clients out of that. I go there because it's just great to be part of the community and I learn something and, we help to raise our profile as well. I mentioned this because at the end of last year, I talked to a lot of marketers and said, well, what do you think of the big trends that are going to happen in 2026? And a recurring theme came up from several marketers. And they said, there's kind of a pushback, a sort of like a reaction against AI and how impersonal it is. And then a lot of people, I think, want that in-person contact, both on the buyer side and on the vendor side. And let's face it, the big events are not particularly brilliant for that. They're better than not meeting in person, but they are pretty impersonal and a little overwhelming. And so small events and small networking groups have the potential to do really well in 2026. I'm curious to know where you think that kind of fits in with what you're doing, and where you think it kind of fits in with the whole sort of sponsored content area.
This goes back to something that I think is core principle of what we should watch for in the next couple of years. And that is, who do people trust, right? Like, that is going to be the core question. And that is who they're going to look to. What's interesting is I think that's going to have a number of answers. Like, there's not going to just be one answer to this question. And so, like, in the media side of things, I think actually Colin and I, and what we're doing at Healthcare IT Today, actually position us well in this Gen AI world where everyone's like, there's so much content about everything. They're going to ask the question, who do we trust?
Mm-hmm.
And they're going to know that Colin and I are at all the events and talking to the vendors and talking to the customers and having them on our CIO podcast and all those things. And so then that builds a different trust with them. And you're right, those in-person events, I can trust that in a very different way if I go to that dinner and I hear firsthand what they've been through, and I build trust, over time through these dinners and through those relationships, right? Ed Marks is doing that through his videos, right? And, same with Bill Russell and them, the videos are helping to build trust that I am someone who's part of this, that understands this, and that you can trust this. Whereas Gen AI, I'm not sure I can trust it or not. Sure, I can use it to make a short list. I can use it to do all sorts of things. But when it comes to trusting something, I think that's going to be the core question of the next few years is, who are people going to turn to trust? Are they going to turn to the big conferences? Are they going to turn to small conferences? Are they going to turn to trusted influencers in the space that are talking to lots of people? I think so. Yeah. And are they going to use Gen AI? And then they're also going to ask the question, which this is an entire, another episode, but who influences Gen AI? Marketing professionals are asking themselves that question, right? Who is going to influence Gen AI? And, you see lots of reports about the value of editorial and how it influences Gen AI. I actually think if you do sponsored content the right way, it influences Gen AI just as much as editorial.
I saw some data recently that said that the majority of citations are from brands. So not from media companies, not from, Reddit. There was this whole thing about, Reddit's the biggest influencer. So it's actually turned out that was kind of not quite true.
But might be true in the consumer side, right?
Could be, yeah. But the biggest source of influence, and you can see it, you can see the site when you look at the citations and it refers to a blog or a white paper, they're mostly branded. And so you can influence the results of AI pretty quickly by structuring content in a particular way. I just want to bring us back to, I think the kind of penny dropped for me when you brought up trust. And it's like, that's what's changed in sponsored content, is that it doesn't really matter whether a vendor is paying for it or not. If it's written the right way and it's written with an editorial bent and it's written with the user in mind, it's trusted. And I think that, to your point, is vendors don't really care if somebody paid to get that piece of content in front of them. If they trust the source, Healthcare IT Today being, a particular source, and they trust the writer, they will trust that content and then what's being represented about that vendor. And I think that's a pretty good place to leave this one on, actually. But before we do that, last question for you. If you could give one piece of advice to people listening to this show for 2026, what would that be?
I have to hit one thing you said, though. You're right about trust. And by the way, anyone that's doing sponsored content, if you do it poorly, you're going to erode that trust really quickly. So it's something you have to be constantly vigilant, in providing value. Otherwise, you will lose trust. What advice would I give people in 2026? wow, if you're a healthcare marketer coming out of 2025, there's been so much uncertainty. There's been so many budget cuts. The sales cycle's slow unless you're an ambient clinical voice company, AI, medical scribe, whatever they're called these days. It's been a lot of uncertainty. But here's what I would say. I was still from a CIO at Sway Health who said, right now is the time to educate. Right now is the time to create that trust with the leaders who are going to buy your product, because maybe they don't have the budget now, but they will. They will eventually. And so right now is the time to be a value-added asset to them so that they know about you, that they trust that you understand the challenges that they face. And so right now is a time to build those relationships. It may be hard, right? Like that takes a long view and hopefully you don't have a leader who's like, how many leads, how much pipeline, how much, because right now that's not where we're at for most organizations in health IT. But there is a great opportunity to be the one that is the trusted partner, that is educating them, that is connecting with them. So don't look at it as like, this sucks. Look at it as an opportunity. Everyone else is suffering. They're cutting their marketing teams. They're cutting their marketing budgets. Well, you have an opportunity to go in and actually help the people. And I'll tell you, the ones that do that, the marketing professionals, or the health IT leaders at provider organizations, they're going to remember that. And those type of memories are long lasting.
I always love talking with John, and I learned so much, and he's just such a great person to talk to. There were quite a lot of insights in this episode, and there were a few things that really stood out to me. So let me go through them. Number one, sponsored content only works when it educates. The moment it turns into a sales pitch, everybody loses. And, that's whether that's the reader, the publisher, or the vendor who's paying for the damn thing. It just doesn't work. So focus on education. Second, this is a biggie. Trust is the real differentiator. Buyers don't actually care that much whether content is paid or whether it's editorial, if it's genuinely valuable and comes from a source they trust. And John's publication, Healthcare IT Today, is certainly one of those. Third, distribution matters more than most marketers actually realize. Sponsored content isn't just about creating something. It's about making it a priority and getting it in front of the right audience consistently. And finally, John's advice for 2026 was spot on. This is the time to educate and build trust. Even if your budgets are tight and deals are slow, you've got to stay the course. Companies that show up with value right now are the ones that buyers are going to remember and they're going to trust for the long term. So huge thanks again to John for joining me. Always insightful, always honest, and always focused on what works best in our industry. Thank you to you for listening to this episode of the Health Tech Marketing Show. And if you found it useful, why don't you subscribe if it's the first time you're listening to it? You can subscribe on any of your favorite podcast applications. You can also see us on YouTube. Just sort of search for the Health Tech Marketing Show and you'll find it. The other thing is, if you think somebody in your community would enjoy this episode, why don't you forward it to them? They might be grateful to you, and I know I will be. Finally, if you'd like to chat about anything that John talked about, you can reach John through the contact information below. Or if you'd like to chat with me about anything that's, you're struggling with this year, whether it's AI, whether it's account-based marketing, whether it's messaging, whether it's content in general, my contact information is down below. I'd love to have a chat with you. Not necessarily a sales pitch, really just an opportunity to chat and give you some advice for what it's worth. So thank you for that. Look forward to seeing you on the next episode.